Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Living Out podcast, the show talking about faith and sexuality. I'm Anne Whitten and I'm joined today by Ed Shaw and Andy Robinson. Hello, how are you both?
Doing all right, thanks, Anne. How are you doing?
Not so bad, fair to middling and other such meaningless phrases.
I'm wearing shorts in September. Isn't that nice?
What?
I know, it's so nice and warm down in the southwest. I mean, I doubt it is up in the northeast. You probably don't know what shorts are, but every so often when it's hot weather, you get to wear shorts in the southwest, and today's one of those days.
I don't actually possess any, is my confession. I just don't possess any shorts. I'm not that optimistic about the weather, so...
Don't you ever go on holiday?
Yeah, but you can wear trousers on holiday. That's allowed.
You could wear a suit on the beach.
To be honest, I would have loved living in that era. That would have been home for me. Suits on the beach sounds like bliss.
Suit of trilby. Yeah.
Yeah.
How very civilised. Ed was asking us a couple of shows ago about what we like to watch on TV, so I thought I would find out what music everybody's enjoying at the moment. What's on your playlist?
So I sort of get stuck, basically. I think most people get stuck more with the music they were listening to as teenagers, so I'm still stuck with sort of R.E.M., Queen, that kind of stuff. I'm stuck and I will not move, basically.
Well, I mean, they're two quality bands, so what can you say? What about you, Ed?
Actually, my Spotify playlist at the moment, you know, they do the suggestions, and the suggestions have just got me onto a guy called Leon Bridges, who is fantastic. 2 tracks, River and Beyond. My problem listening to music is I fall in love with a piece of music and then I flog it to death. I listen to it again and again and again. At the moment, I'm listening to those 2 things on loop. In about 2 days' time, I shall never want to listen to them again. But at the moment, they're bringing me a lot of joy.
I'm having a similar experience with a worship song that I've recently discovered called I Will Follow by John Guerra, and I'm just listening to it over and over again and playing it on my ukulele, so probably slowly ruining it.
Oh, and spiritual brownie points to Anne for mentioning a spiritual song.
Yeah, thanks. So in this series of the Living Out podcast, we're exploring 8 questions that we get asked most often. You can find these on the homepage of the Living Out site, which is livingout.org, and we're tackling one per podcast. And today's question is, how important is all this? So is sexuality really a big deal? Do Christians need to fall out over it, or is it just something we can agree to disagree on? And how can we respond when churches and denominations change their stance? So first of all, I thought it'd be interesting to explore why Christians are obsessed with sex when there seem to be lots of other pressing issues like injustice or poverty or creation care. Why are we just focusing in on sex all the time?
I think if you care about those sort of things, you need to end up caring about sexual ethics. So if you care about justice, if you want to fight against injustice, you want to talk about sexual ethics, because one of the things that happens when people don't have good sexual ethics is that injustice is done, and in particular women are abused. If you care about poverty, you need to care about sexual ethics, because so often one of the leading causes of poverty is people being born into families where, you know, again, especially dads are not making the right provision for children they've had with women. If you care about creation care, you're going to be worried about population growth. Or if you're a Christian and you think that one of the things God's told us to do is to fill this earth and rule it, you're going to care about how we bring about the next generation. So if you care about all those things, inevitably at some point, you're going to be wanting to speak up about sexual ethics and care about sexual ethics, because sex and relationships interweave with every part of life and all those other important things like injustice, poverty, creation care, and a whole host of other things. So that would just be one answer to that question. Care about those things. You've got to care about sexual ethics too.
And I think if you care about people, you're going to talk about sexuality and sexual ethics. I mean, it's just the thing we often feel most keenly and most deeply. It goes to the essence of who we are. And so it's no surprise, actually, as you see Jesus relating to people in the Gospels, actually issues of sexuality come up, perhaps those whose lives have been messed up by the way they've handled their sexuality. So if we care about people, we're going to care about the things that we feel most keenly and most deeply. It'd be quite weird not to talk about sexuality, actually.
Yeah, I suppose it is a fairly fundamental thing. It's like food, isn't it? I mean, there are certain sort of basics that, I mean, we're all here because somebody had sex, I suppose.
Well, yeah, and also God thinks it's quite important. I mean, this is a pretty provocative way of putting it, but, God seems to be quite preoccupied with sex in the sense that he talks about it a lot. When we say, why do Christians talk so much about sex? Well, because God seems to talk about sex and relationships and sexuality quite a lot. His book, the Bible, begins with a marriage, ends with a marriage. At the heart of it, Song of Songs, which, as we all know, is all about the sexual love between a man and a woman. The passages that he uses to express his love for us, some of the most graphic, are him using the language of sex and sexuality to do that. Again and again, actually, it's God that's talking about sex and sexual ethics and sexuality and marriage and relationships. And Christians, in talking about these things a lot, are just copying God, as we should be as his followers.
Yeah, and I think picking up on what you were saying, Ed, about it being kind of fundamental to lots of other different areas in our culture and in our relationships, I think I'd sort of thought about it as a matter of private ethics that doesn't really affect anybody else. But actually, the longer I've gone on as a Christian and the more I've read the Bible, the more I've seen it fundamentally affects how we relate together and how we do community and how we love other people well. And it isn't just a case of what people sort of privately do in the bedroom. So, yeah, I think I suppose that's the reason why I think it's important to engage theologically with sex and with with how we should understand our bodies and how we should understand how we relate to each other as God's ordained it in his word.
So it's interesting what culture's done, isn't it, recently? Because again, 20 years ago, people were saying, I know, what you do sexually is just a private matter. That was a big thing in the 90s. But now, in the last 5+ years, the whole #MeToo movement, the amount of sexual abuse that's taken over, has massively made society wake up to the fact that it does matter what people do in their bedrooms, because so often actually what they're doing has an impact on other areas of life, and the only reason they've got somebody in the bedroom is because of a power dynamic that, again, usually a man's using to abuse a woman. So these things do matter, even when we've in previous generations said, well, we shouldn't go there. Actually, people are wanting to go there because this is a deeply powerful and painful thing for area of life for people so often.
Do you think that's kind of a good development then, that we've got to, that we've got past the whole don't ask, don't tell sort of thing and, moved into an area where people actually realise that it matters to a holistic view of life?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose what we're saying is sexuality matters, it's hugely important, at the same time as saying that it's not ultimate. And I think that's the sort of challenge, actually. I think both extremes have got real problems. Either sort of sexuality doesn't matter. And I guess probably ironically, actually, the church would have been critiqued sort of 20, 30 years ago for never talking about sex because we were all prudish. Now, in a sense, the criticism is we're talking about it all the time. That what we want to say is sexuality isn't ultimate, but it is an important aspect of who we are, and so we've got to give it attention.
And I suppose it's a way in which Christians are quite countercultural as well, isn't it? I mean, I suppose culturally 50 years ago, sex outside marriage was more taboo, whereas now, the culture has kind of moved away from what I suppose you'd call traditional Christian norms. And so the way that we steward our sexuality is looking more and more different from the world around us. So in a sense, that's a missional opportunity as well to show that actually following Jesus kind of makes you really odd and makes you stick out and gives you a whole set of different values to those of the culture.
I think that's right. And in some ways, there's always a temptation for Christians to be almost ashamed of our sexual ethic. But essentially what we're saying is we believe we know the Creator. He knows what's best. Actually, the Christian sexual ethic should be good and what is right for all creatures, all those that God has made. And so I want to encourage us not to be ashamed of it.
Yeah. Me too. And we've got some good stuff on the website along those lines to help give us confidence that God's pattern for sexuality is really good. Ed's written an article called "What is Sexuality For?" Which is a really helpful grounding in the sort of biblical vision for human flourishing. And I'm a bit of an Ed fan today because he's written another article as well called "Why Should the Church Be Debating Homosexuality?" which is a really helpful way of understanding why we should be talking about this, particularly homosexuality, but sexuality in general as well. So I'd encourage people to go and read that. So let me throw in a bit of a tricky question then, and see how you guys respond. Why can't Christians just agree to disagree about what the Bible says on homosexuality? And indeed, there are some Christians who think we can just agree to disagree. You know, you've got your opinion, I've got mine. Let's not fall out about it. Is that an adequate response?
I don't think it is. I mean, there are certain areas where it doesn't go to the heart of the Christian faith where I think Christians can agree to disagree. But this isn't one of those issues. One of the things we said quite a lot on this podcast is our sexuality is a trailer or a signpost to what is ultimate. It's a picture of the love story at the heart of the universe. And so actually to distort your sexual ethic is in a sense to mar and disfigure the picture of what the universe is about. That's not a small thing. And so for that reason, this isn't just an area where we can agree to disagree, it seems to me.
And I think one of the ways in which the church down the centuries has tried to work out, as it were, what are essential things and what are things we're free to disagree with is in some ways to just try and work out which beliefs, which doctrines, which practices have been followed by every Christian everywhere and all the time. And when it comes to marriage being between a man and a woman and sex being for the marriage of a man and a woman, that is something that Christians everywhere have believed all the time. You know, go back through human history, it is only a historical aberration of the last, 20, 30, 40, 50 years when Christians have begun to change their mind on what is marriage for, who is marriage for, and whether you can have sex outside the marriage of a man and a woman. So that should immediately make me think, okay, Christians have always agreed on this. It's only now that Christians are feeling free to disagree on this. That should make me suspicious and make me think that this is probably something essential because it's something that Christians have always united around. And the fact that we're not uniting around it now suggests it's more of a sort of a cultural moment and therefore a change that I should be suspicious of rather than one of these things. You know, there are many things that Christians around the world have disagreed on at different times in different places, like baptism or just how church government's done, things like that. But this would seem to be in a different category and therefore something we're not at liberty to change or disagree over.
And I think the Bible actually addresses this issue itself. So I was looking recently at two of the churches that Jesus writes to in Revelation chapter 2. And there's two churches actually where the false teachers coming in and they're suggesting a different pattern of sexual morality. And Jesus' response isn't, hey, that's fine, just accept each other. He actually critiques the church for tolerating this, for allowing this false teaching to come in. So it does seem to me that Jesus insists this is not an area where you can disagree. This is an area where it is actually wrong to accept another definition of sexuality and sexual ethics than the one he gives.
Where's that, Andy? In Revelation?
Yeah, so in Revelation chapter 2, you get the Jesus letter to the church of Thyatira and to Pergamum. Slightly different situations, but in both churches you have idolatry and sexual immorality. And funnily enough, they're linked, aren't they? So I think actually once you begin to accept a different sexual ethic, it's because you actually have a different concept of what God is like. And it's also, to be honest, because you've begun to see sexual satisfaction as the sort of supreme good, all of which is actually a fundamental distortion of the Christian faith. It's all linked together. It's not a sort of nice, hermetically sealed sort of area you can disagree on and it doesn't affect everything else. it changes everything once you distort your sexual ethic.
Yeah, I often think of that kind of analogy of pulling a loose thread on a jumper and recognizing it is attached. And then, before too long, you've unraveled the entire jumper. And I think sometimes we don't realize that it isn't a compartmentalized ethical issue. It is, how we conduct ourselves sexually is of fundamental importance. And I think, like you say, that how we view God is really central to that. And I think we've talked a little bit before about, do we really trust that God has the best for us, that he's not trying to deprive us of something good? And I guess that's where, as Brits, it's very uncomfortable to disagree with somebody on something so fundamental and something that, it causes a lot of pain. But I guess, it isn't loving and it isn't kind to affirm somebody in something that is bad for them and is sinful. And actually, the loving thing to do is to emulate Christ in, fully loving and embracing people, but also challenging them on things that are not the right way to live.
I remember a few years ago I was visiting a church that was, if I'm honest, moving away from a sort of sexual ethic of marriage being between a man and a woman, and they got me in to sort of try and put the traditional case, as it were. And I remember as I spent time with the church, I realised it wasn't just that we disagreed on sexuality, we actually disagreed on pretty much everything. So we actually disagreed on discipleship, because I was saying, well, actually part of discipleship is self-denial and taking up a cross, and they were saying, well, you can't expect somebody to deny their sexuality. We actually disagreed on suffering. So I was saying, well, part of life now is some element of pain because that's worth it in the long run. And to be honest, they were mainly talking about satisfaction here and now. We ended up disagreeing on quite a lot, actually disagreed on the Bible. In a sense, because everything is connected, it's not that you can disagree on this and it doesn't change everything.
And I think it's worth recognising that so often people are changing their minds on sexuality, just to time with what Andy was saying, in some way, most of all because of the cultural pressure. And if you are someone that whenever you come across part of the Bible that is unacceptable to the culture, you change your mind, you start, obviously you get rid of traditional Christian sexual ethics, but also you then have real problems about, Jesus being the only way for salvation. You have problems around, how you interact with other religions. You start to actually think, some of the, basically you start to do a Thomas Jefferson and have to take a lot out of your Bible. I think, what people think and where people are at around the debate around sexuality at the moment often ties in with their view on how the church should be interacting with culture. If the people think the way to win people to Christ is to go with the culture, they're going to change their mind on this. But we always know, and history's proved time and time again, that actually Christianity has been most attractive to outsiders when it's actually gone against the culture and modelled a better way. And so one of the challenges for us is those who believe the traditional viewpoint is just to make sure that we're making it look attractive, and we're proving how important it is by the tenor of our lives and by what we, by the fact that we're living in churches that are willing to be countercultural in a whole number of ways.
Yeah.
Campaigning on sexual ethics and also in justice, poverty, and creation care as well, because all these things matter and intertwined, and all of these, in all of these areas, Christianity has got something very countercultural and important to say.
Yeah. And not just to say, but to embody. I think one of the most compelling ways of introducing people to the goodness of the gospel is the way that we relate together. And I think, it's not just enough to say this is what the Bible teaches on sexuality, but we have to have kind of plausible ways of living that out in the way that we relate with each other. So we are family. We need to do that well. We need to care for each other. We need to hug each other. We need to, demonstrate and live out that intimacy that we're saying people don't need to miss out on by not having sex. But we can't just say that. We've got to put our money where our mouth is, so that we're like the church in Acts 2, and people go, oh, they've got something I want. There's something attractive about that community.
I think that's right, because if it's the case that, as Jesus says, take up our cross, denying ourselves, is actually the pathway to life, that's what we want to demonstrate is, yeah, this is countercultural. Yes, this involves painful decisions, but actually it really is the way to flourish. And I think we can be confident in that. It is, absolutely.
You're listening to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. For more stories, resources and events, visit our website at livingout.org. We all here agree that, you know, sexuality, homosexuality are really important issues. They're not something that, you know, that's just a kind of peripheral thing that we can agree to disagree about. There's something fundamental to the gospel. So I wanted in this last section to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening in various denominations and churches, about repositioning on same-sex sexual relationships. And I guess, you know, for celibate same-sex attracted Christians like us, that can be really painful. I know I find it really difficult when churches and denominations and individual Christians change their mind on this issue. And we know that just recently the church in Wales has decided to bless same-sex marriages. So I just wondered how did it make you guys feel, and how do you deal with this kind of thing?
I suppose two things I'd say. I'd absolutely agree that I find it painful. So I mentioned a church that I spent time with, which was changing its mind, and the reason I was there was because there were friends in the church, and I found that hugely painful, actually. I suppose, though, the second thing I would say is that I wasn't entirely surprised. So in a sense, it's quite encouraging that I can quote Revelation 2 and say right at the beginning this was happening. You know, you read in the New Testament that in the early church there are different opinions, there's false teaching that pops up, including in this sort of area. So I think it's painful, but I'm not totally surprised by it, because in different forms this sort of thing has happened all the way through the history of the church. So don't be too discouraged. Don't think, you know, the world is ending or the church is collapsing. This kind of stuff's always happened.
That's really helpful, because I think sometimes we can be very involved in our moment in time, and we forget that, you know, God's people have been around for a long time, and God has always been faithful, and he has always kept his promises, and he will continue to do so. So it's not our generation that's going to mess everything up. You know, the kingdom of God is bigger than that.
I think our response to churches changing their minds on this, particular and denominations, is just recognise that we should be sad and mourning, because what's happening is a church or a denomination is dying. That's what's happening in the Church of Wales. That's what's happening in the Episcopalian Church across the Atlantic. Is they're dying. Their numbers are going down. There are wonderful examples of renewed life in Orthodox evangelical churches in their midst, but by and large, as a denomination, they're dying because they've walked away from biblical truth, and it's biblical truth that is attractive to people, and it's biblical truth which Jesus uses to draw people to himself. And the tragedy that I think is happening in places like the Church in Wales and many other sort of denominations in the UK and the wider West is that churches are dying, and that is an incredibly painful thing to watch, because churches are walking away from what brings life, which is Jesus and his gospel. And so we should be mourning that, but also we should be recognizing that there are reasons to hope, because what we haven't lost is the gospel, and what we haven't lost is Jesus, and he does bring life. And in all these circumstances, there's usually a period of acute pain and a huge amount of relationships being broken, and a mess, and legal battles and things like that. But Jesus brings life, and Jesus is bringing life, sometimes amongst the wreckage of the denomination, sometimes in new denominations or new churches that spring out of churches that have walked away from biblical orthodoxy. And we should expect that to happen, because that's what Jesus does. He preserves his church. He keeps it going. And he's pretty good at bringing life out of death.
He's got form on this, hasn't he?
He has got form.
And am I right in thinking, Ed, that you're sort of doing a bit of thinking and perhaps writing in this kind of area, just to sort of help us think through some of the changes?
Yeah, so I'm part of a mainstream Protestant denomination, the Church of England, which is going for its own conversation on sexuality. And I've got to think about, personally, what will I do if and when what is happening in the church in Wales at the moment happens in my denomination, and what will the implications for that be for me and my personal membership of that denomination and my church's membership of that denomination, and what would it feel like in particular? And just speaking to friends who've been really affected by what's happening in the Church of Wales, and the fact that I spoke at a few years back, I was invited to speak to the evangelical group in the Church of Wales around what we believe about sexuality. So I know the women and men that have been standing for orthodoxy and how difficult this experience is going to be for them. And I want to do a bit of thinking about what hope there is. And I've perhaps said enough to be the beginning of a blog post at some point over the next few months.
That'd be great. Yeah, I mean, it leads on to the next question, really, which was a more kind of personal one. Do you have any wisdom for people whose churches have rejected an orthodox biblical view of sexuality? Because, it's hard when, our churches are family. Often we've been in our churches for a long time and we're invested in them. But, churches sometimes do go from kind of orthodoxy to changing their stance. What do you do, especially if you're a same-sex attracted Christian in those churches?
When friends of mine Christian friends of mine have changed their view on this, or churches or denominations, I think there's a common pattern. I think I want to recognise that it changes the nature of my relationship with them. Whether that's a friendship, whether that's membership of a church or membership of a denomination, it changes things. It doesn't mean that the relationship stops, that you walk away, you never speak to them again, and that's you necessarily sort of just end it all there. But you just need to be honest and open that it changes things. And they used to support you, they no longer support you. They used to think what you were doing was a good thing, they now think it's a bad thing or an unnecessary thing, or they're often implying that it's a slightly silly, eccentric thing. And so the relationship's changed, and you need to recognise that and go through quite a mourning period probably, and make sure that you get the new friendships perhaps you need, and perhaps the new church and denomination that you need, so that your relationship with God the Father, Son and Holy Spirit isn't changed, and so that you don't end up in a same-sex relationship with yourself because nobody was supporting you in staying in good relationship with classic Christian sexual ethics. So I think just recognise the relationship's changed. But you're still going to continue to be in some form of relationship with people you disagree with. Yeah. Mainly because you want to call them back to, you want to call them to repentance and help people to see that bearing Christian sexual ethics is an act of self-harm. And one of the things, we've all got friends who have, in effect, in their own lives, got rid of Christian sexual ethics, the promise of a better life, and they found out that it hasn't been. It's been something that's brought great harm to their lives, and they've returned to classic Christian sexual ethics and found that what they sort of had dismissed as being bad for them is actually for the best for them. So staying in relationship with friends, with churches, with denominations that have turned their back in some way or form, it's going to change. It's still important because you want them to change back. It's not the end of the story.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that one of the key New Testament words is gentleness. Actually, you see that actually in places like 2 Timothy, where Timothy has those who in some ways are opposing the gospel, actually, but he's told to deal with them gently. And so just in terms of the tone we adopt and the sort of attitude of our hearts, we're going to want to be gentle. But having said that, if you were to ask me, if you're a same-sex attracted Christian in a church context that is now saying, encouraging you to enter a relationship, I need to be honest, I would leave that church. I just think I couldn't stay there. And actually there is a sense as well within the New Testament of actually putting a gap between us. So, as Ed said, the relationship changes. And so are there circumstances where this is sufficient to have to leave a church? Sadly, honestly, I would say yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've had similar experience. I've had sort of good, close friends that I've been in prayer triplets with, or, done kind of accountability and discipleship with, who have changed their minds. And I've found that incredibly painful. And, it has, we have had to sort of do things differently. I can't kind of do discipleship alongside somebody who's now done an about turn and is trying to drag me back the other direction. But as Ed says, trying to maintain relationship as well to be a good witness, I think that's helpful if you can. But I think, for me, I want to try and guard my heart, and I want to try and make sure that I have the support to cheer me on, because I know, I can sometimes overestimate how strong I am, and I I sometimes feel like I'm in a lion's den surrounded by everybody who's kind of wanting me to fail in a way because they think that I'm striving for the wrong thing. So I think it is really important to have people around you who are 100% behind you and want you to honour God with your sexuality. But yeah, not cut off everybody that you disagree with as well, because, we do need to be speaking truth to people who have different opinions. Actually, Andrew Goddard's written a really good article for our website about how we can have good discussions with Christians who disagree with us on sexuality. There's some really good, practical, wise tips on there, so I'd recommend that.
One of the reasons why Andrew's article is so good is that he models it. I know Andrew through a lot of the conversations having with the Church of England and the friendships he's built with people who do disagree, and the understanding he's increased of why we disagree has been extraordinary, because he doesn't just write articles. The article comes out of his personal experience, and that's why I think it's a remarkable read.
And there's just a little verse, I think it's in 2 Timothy actually, where Timothy's facing opposition and is persevering, and Paul says to him, the Lord knows who are his, and part of it is just holding on to the Lord knows, actually. So I remember that experience of sort of driving away from the church, which I could see changing their mind, and had a great reception from them, and just in the end, the only thing that keeps you going is a sense ultimately of a Lord's well done. And so if you're increasingly feeling in a minority, the Lord knows, the Lord sees. Actually, the Lord says, well done, ultimately. And so just cling to the fact that he knows what's going on.
And also, you're not, you might be in a minority in your local expression of your church or denomination, but you are in the vast majority of Christians, down the ages on this planet at the moment, who have, found goodness in what God says about sex and marriage and relationships. And I think that's what I try and do when I'm having a bit of an Elijah moment. It is me and me alone. I just want to say, absolute rubbish. You are standing with, the worldwide church. You're standing with, the church that's looking on down from heaven, gathered around the throne now, cheering us on, and to remember that.
Yeah. Hebrews 12, isn't it? Since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let's press on, fixing our eyes on Jesus. I think that's a good place to end. So thanks, guys. Time is up, but if you want to explore this question further, and obviously there's lots more to think about and to say, head to our website, livingout.org. We've got lots of articles, videos, blogs, and other resources to help out. Thanks to Ed and Andy for joining me, and thank you to you for listening. If you like what you've heard, then please give us a good rating on your podcast provider, and do subscribe as well so that you don't miss any future episodes. And we look forward to being with you again soon. Bye for now.